You are 60, maybe 62, maybe 65. You have been watching what you eat for years. You walk every day. You have cut back on sugar. You have tried fasting, and the belly fat will not move. Not slowly, not at all. And every year, it seems slightly worse than the year before, even when nothing about your habits has changed. And you're starting to wonder if this is just what 60 looks like. If this is just your body now, it is not. But the reason your belly fat is not responding has almost nothing to do with what you are eating or how much you are moving. It has everything to do with a fundamental shift in your hormonal architecture that happens after 60, one that most doctors never explain and most fat loss content never addresses. Today, we are going to address it, but first, I need to tell you something that completely reframes what is happening in your body after 60. After 60, your body is operating in a hormonal environment that is categorically different from what it was at 50. Not slightly different, categorically different. The decline in sex hormones, testosterone in men, estrogen in women, that began in your 40s and 50s has now reached a threshold where the downstream hormonal effects are qualitatively different. Specifically, three things have changed that make visceral fat accumulation after 60 a fundamentally different biological problem than it was a decade earlier. First, your growth hormone output during sleep has declined so significantly that the overnight fat burning that was still partially functional at 50 is now operating at a fraction of its former capacity. Second, your cortisol sensitivity in visceral fat tissue has increased to the point where even mild stress produces a visceral fat storage response that would have been negligible at 45. Third, your insulin sensitivity has declined to the point where even moderate carbohydrate intake produces a prolonged insulin elevation that keeps visceral fat locked for hours. These three changes together create a hormonal environment where visceral fat is almost continuously protected, and the interventions that worked at 50 produce minimal results at 62 because the hormonal context is completely different. Here is what specifically changes after 60 that makes visceral fat so resistant. And this is where it gets genuinely eye-opening. The first change is growth hormone collapse. At 50, your growth hormone was already significantly reduced compared to 30. But after 60, particularly in men after testosterone falls below a critical threshold and in women after estrogen is consistently low, growth hormone output during deep sleep declines dramatically further. Research published in 2025 confirmed that adults over 60 produce on average 75% less growth hormone during sleep than adults in their 30s, and that this decline accelerates significantly after 60 compared to the relatively gradual decline between 30 and 60. Growth hormone is the primary overnight fat-burning hormone. It directly drives lipolysis, the breakdown of stored fat during sleep. Without it, your overnight fat-burning window is essentially closed. You fast all night, you sleep, and visceral fat barely moves because the hormonal signal that should be releasing it is almost absent. The second change is cortisol amplification at the visceral fat level. We have covered cortisol extensively on this channel, but after 60, the relationship between cortisol and visceral fat changes in a way that is qualitatively different. As sex hormones decline, the cortisol receptor density in visceral fat tissue increases further, meaning the same cortisol signal that had a moderate fat storage effect at 50 now has a dramatically larger effect at 62. Minor stressors that would have produced negligible visceral fat accumulation at a younger age are now producing significant deposits of deep abdominal fat. A slightly poor night of sleep, a stressful morning, a missed meal. Each of these produces a cortisol response that is disproportionately stored as visceral fat after 60 in ways that simply did not apply a decade earlier. And now, the twist that changes how you think about fat loss after 60 completely. The standard fat loss advice, eat less, move more, increase the deficit, is not just ineffective after 60. For many people, it actively makes the situation worse. Here's why. Aggressive calorie restriction after 60 elevates cortisol significantly, and after 60, that cortisol hits visceral fat receptors with dramatically greater potency than it did at 50. You are creating more cortisol through restriction, and that cortisol is producing more visceral fat storage than ever. The restriction is working against itself. The people who see visceral fat loss after 60 are almost never the ones who restrict most aggressively. They are the ones who have found the specific hormonal levers that work in a post-60 body. And those levers are different from anything that worked before. So what actually works after 60? The first lever is protecting sleep with absolute priority. After 60, sleep is not a lifestyle preference. It is the primary driver of whatever growth hormone output your body is still capable of producing. Every hour of lost deep sleep after 60 is growth hormone that is not being released and fat that is not being burned. Cool room, complete darkness, consistent sleep time 7 days a week, no alcohol, no food within 3 hours of sleep. These are not suggestions. After 60, they are the non-negotiable foundation of any fat loss strategy. The second lever is resistance training above everything else. After 60, visceral fat responds to resistance training through a mechanism that becomes increasingly important as cardio becomes less effective, specifically the improvement in insulin sensitivity that resistance training produces in muscle tissue. More insulin-sensitive muscle means lower post-meal insulin. Lower post-meal insulin means visceral fat spends more time in an accessible state. 2 to 3 sessions of resistance training per week, even body weight squats, push-ups, and rows produce measurable improvements in insulin sensitivity that directly reduce visceral fat accumulation over months. The third lever is the most counterintuitive one. Eat more protein, not less food. More protein. After 60, your protein threshold for muscle protein synthesis, anabolic resistance, is even higher than at 50, and muscle mass is the metabolic engine that keeps insulin sensitivity high and cortisol effects manageable. 40 to 50 grams of complete protein per meal, every meal. This is not optional after 60. It is the nutritional foundation that keeps the metabolic machinery running. Drop a comment and tell me, are you over 60 and dealing with belly fat that simply will not respond? I want to know. And if this video finally explained why the standard advice stopped working, subscribe.